Hi, my name's Jeremy. My article was to be based on advertising and recruiting, and the title is Gender-Based Hiring Invites Scrutiny. The article starts off by discussing the Lawry's Prime Rib Restaurant and how in 1922 they made a bold move to switch from the rest of the restaurant world and begin only using females or women as servers. It took 70 years for this to develop enough scrutiny to form a legal issue, and that was brought about by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And this scrutiny was brought about in the form of a lawsuit, and a class action lawsuit, which the EEOC later comes to say that is something that's rather rare, because it's not simply enough to just state that there's discrimination and that means that there's a case. There needs to be evidence, and that's something that we go into later that is rather difficult to prove that you were or weren't hired based on your sex. Later after the lawsuit was brought about, the Lawry's Prime Rib Restaurant went ahead and settled outside of court for more than $1 million, which was later dispersed amongst an unknown number of complainants of men who filed charges feeling that they had not received a job based on their sex. However, in 2004, the company decided finally that after $1 million, it was time to switch their ways and begin hiring men instead of simply women for their positions. At that time, it exceeded 21% of the company's workforce had then become men. However, according to the EEOC, simply hiring men wasn't enough for the lawyers. They wanted to see more. And the settlement was further included that Lawry's had to agree to pay $500,000 to an unknown number of men that deemed that they had been denied a service position between 2003 and 2006, which they state could have been paid out to potentially hundreds of plaintiffs, but because it was settled outside of court and it was a private lawsuit, those numbers haven't been disclosed. After that, the company also agreed to shell out another $225,000 in training to ensure that the staff and the company itself would be in compliance with the new terms of their hiring policy and what they would have. On top of that, another $300,000 was devoted to advertising, and that was to advertise that men would be allowed to become servers at the Lawry's restaurant, and as well as their sister company, the Five Crowns. And even better yet, above that, another step was taken, and that was that an EEOC officer was to be hired and kept on staff and report strictly to the chief executive of the Lawry's Prime, and keep them in check to know if they were meeting standards and continuing with what their agreement had been settled in the court case. Gender discrimination is not something that's new to the restaurant industry. It's been around for quite some time, and the EEOC says that in 2009 there were 21 discrimination lawsuits alone filed against restaurant companies, specifically based on hiring practices of gender. And 9 of those were filed by men, while 12 were filed by women. So it's obviously a larger issue it appears to be a larger issue for women than it is to men not being hired. But something in the reverse situation of the Palm restaurant would be something we're all familiar with called Hooters, where how often would you see, and I don't believe I've ever seen, a male server at Hooters, which we can go and discuss how Hooters maintains a ability to do so. And the way they go about that, and the way other companies still maintain their ingrained traditions of keeping male or only female servers about, is doing so with, I guess, what you would call loopholes. And the way they do so is that they argue with the theory of a bona fide occupational qualification. And they go to explain that a layman's term of that would be that it wouldn't be okay for a male to apply for the position of a dressing room attendant for a women's dressing room. So the way they continue to go with that is that Hooters says that it wouldn't be correct for a male to apply for the position of a server at a restaurant, at a Hooters restaurant, which its identity and its form is shaped around the women servers in orange shorts and white t-shirts with the owl and Hooters written on them. The Palm restaurant in 2003 altered their recruitment practices. Instead of avoiding the situation or finding a loophole, And their practice was in order to bring in more women rather than men, because they had established an identity of using only male servers to bring back the old-time world of the luxurious, only male-served dining atmosphere. And the reason they went about changing their policy in 2003 was because they had to pay out a $500,000 lawsuit in class funds to avoid the lawsuit altogether. It was actually a private settlement as well, which, as I've come to read on, it appears to be that the majority of lawsuits filed for discrimination are settled outside of court, and it seems pretty logical the reason they would do so is to keep their name out of the news and to keep any form of a definitive conclusion on the case being that they were guilty or not guilty. They kind of skate around on it and they go and do it in the quiet corner, and there doesn't have to be the publicity given about whether it was bad, whether they were wrong, or they were right. In the past, it had been a very common practice to hire an all-male wait staff, and that was to keep that old world ambiance as we were discussing. And in the same breath, it's understood now, most of us understand that that's flagrantly discriminatory, as it directly quotes, just quoting from this article, and that majority of us believe that that's wrong, but in the same breath, we still support restaurants like Hooters itself. So I'm not quite sure where the article was trying to reach, because it argues for both ways. It doesn't appear to have a bias whatsoever. It states what we used to allow and what we no longer say we allow, but in the same breath it said how some of the restaurants that still exist today, like Hooters or Razzoos, get away with still, I can't say technically discriminate, but how they still get away with maintaining a strictly gender-based staff of all males or all females. So with that being said, it was a good article, and I appreciated learning what I did about the problems of it, but I feel like it in some ways might give you a dark side to it, because it'll tell you what's wrong with it and tell you it is wrong and where it exists, but it also tells you how to avoid it, and not necessarily by hiring both men and women, but by telling you how to do so by finding the loophole of, like I stated, the bona fide occupational qualification, like the male attendant for a female dressing room. It seems like it's a very gray area, and it's not that it seems, it definitely is, but if I were put in this instance, I don't see the need that I would like to own a restaurant for sure someday. I would never contemplate in my mind having an all-male staff or an all-female staff, because guaranteed there will be women who want to see a male bartender, or women who want to see a female bartender, and vice versa, a male who wants to see a female bartender, or a male who wants to only be served by a male bartender. I wouldn't try and limit my clientele to one way or the other based on what I believe would set the correct ambiance, as the term says, the old world ambiance. So I feel like, why not cover both bases, more than both bases? Why not cover